Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This video is part one in a series exposing fraud in the newly released National Climate Assessment. This page of the National Climate Assessment, titled Climate Change Indicators, is chock full of misinformation. But in this video, I'm just going to focus on this graph over here, U.S. heat waves. Let's take a closer look at that graph. Note how the graph begins in the 1960s, but the graph below it begins in 1910. The U.S. heat wave graph shows that heat waves have been increasing in the U.S. since the 1960s. So why did they begin their graph in the 1960s and not show any data from prior to that? I'm pretty sure we had data, because I remember the 1950s. Now let's look at the data which they're hiding in the National Climate Assessment. The United States has by far the best daily temperature records of any large area in the world, and most of it is stored in the United States Historical Climatology Network database from NOAA. This graph shows the percent of days above 95 degrees Fahrenheit at all United States Historical Climatology Network stations over the past century. What this graph shows is that prior to 1960, 95-degree days were much more common in the United States. In fact, in 1936, 10% of days over the entire year were above 95 degrees. Now we're down closer to 4%. The frequency of 95-degree days in the United States has dropped nearly in half over the past century. Now we can see exactly what the National Climate Assessment is hiding from us. I marked in pink all the data which they're hiding. It was really hot back then. The graph on the right is their graph, which starts in the 1960s. You can see that they very conveniently cherry-picked a low point to start their graph, and that way they can show a little bit of an upward trend since 1960s. So what they've done is they've turned a very strong cooling trend into a slight warming trend by just hiding all the inconvenient data. These climate scientists want you to believe that they're very serious people protecting the planet, when in fact you can see that they're just a bunch of fraudsters. They're trying to pull the wool over your eyes with some very deceptive practices. Let's look now at some more of the information which they're hiding from you. This is a graph of the percent of stations in the United States reaching 95 degrees per year over the last century. In 1931, 93% of the U.S. reached 95 degrees sometime during the year. It bottomed out in 2014 when only 55% of the U.S. reached 95 degrees. The trend is going sharply downward. A lot less of the United States reaches 95 degrees now than did 100 years ago. The average summer maximum temperature has also declined sharply. In 1936, the average summer afternoon temperature was 89 degrees. Now we're down closer to about 85 degrees. It's dropped about 4 degrees since 1936. The point of the National Climate Assessment is, of course, to blame carbon dioxide for all the bad weather and hot temperatures. So let's take a closer look at that. This graph plots the average summer maximum temperature in the U.S. on the y-axis versus atmospheric carbon dioxide on the x-axis. You can see that as carbon dioxide has increased, summer maximum temperatures have been decreasing, and that in fact U.S. summer maximum temperatures peaked when carbon dioxide was 310 parts per million. Now let's look at the percent of days in summer above 95 degrees versus atmospheric carbon dioxide. When CO2 was 310 parts per million, 34% of days were above 95 degrees. Now we're down below 15% with CO2 above 400 parts per million. As atmospheric CO2 has increased, the frequency of hot days has decreased. Let's look at one more graph now. It's the summer percent of stations reaching 95 degrees Fahrenheit versus atmospheric CO2. You can see that the percent of stations reaching 95 degrees in the United States peaked when CO2 was 308 parts per million. 93% of the U.S. reached 95 degrees sometime during that summer, whereas now we're down closer to 65% with CO2 above 400 parts per million. As atmospheric CO2 has increased, the area of the United States getting very hot has sharply decreased. If these climate scientists who wrote the National Climate Assessment were actual honest scientists, they would want you to know this information. But they don't want you to know it. They're hiding it from you. That's because they have an agenda to demonize carbon dioxide. At one point in the National Climate Assessment, they do briefly discuss the heat of the 1930s with this statement. Over timescales shorter than a decade, the 1930s Dust Bowl remains the peak period for extreme heat in the United States for a variety of reasons, including exceptionally dry springs coupled with poor land management practices during that era. This statement is again very deceptive for a number of reasons. First of all, they say timescales shorter than a decade. Well, we saw from those graphs that it was much hotter in the United States prior to the 1960s for many decades. And then they blame the Dust Bowl on farmers. The map on the right shows the Dust Bowl region in the United States. You can see it's a relatively small area surrounding the Oklahoma Panhandle. Now let's compare that to the NOAA drought map from July 1934 in the United States, when you can see more than 80% of the United States was covered with drought. The National Climate Assessment is trying to blame the heat and drought of the 1930s on some farmers around the Oklahoma Panhandle. In this graphic, I overlaid the Dust Bowl area on top of the U.S. drought map from 1934. You can see this little tiny area of bad farming practices compared to the huge area of drought. It's pretty crazy blaming the drought on these farmers in Oklahoma. But it's actually much worse than that. The drought wasn't just in the United States in 1934, it was worldwide. Worldwide drought is seen likely. Weatherman admits there's something wrong and that no one knows why. This was an article by the chief meteorologist of the United States. 1934, cold, heat, drought, and flood set new marks. 1934, world heating up, ice dissolving at poles. Sea level will rise 40 feet. That's from 1934, the same nonsense we're hearing now. So according to the National Climate Assessment, this worldwide drought, cold, heat, floods, drought, ice dissolving at the poles, sea level rise, was all caused by farmers in the Oklahoma Panhandle. These climate experts at the National Climate Assessment have taken superstition back to the days of the Salem witch trials, when witches were blamed for cooking the weather. Now they blame farmers in the Oklahoma Panhandle for the worldwide drought of the 1930s, and they blame climate skeptics for all recent bad weather. Temperatures were above 110 degrees all over the Midwest during the summer of 1936. They reached 121 degrees in North Dakota that summer. People were dropping dead in the streets all over the country. Heat wave toll over 12,086 cities in 1 week, July 25, 1936. August 12, 1936 was the hottest day on record in Texas and Oklahoma. Both states reached 120 degrees that day. The Great Plains and Midwest were unbearably hot in the 1930s. In fact, millions of people fled the heat and drought of the 1930s and moved out to California. John Steinbeck poignantly wrote about this in his novel, The Grapes of Wrath. But the heat wasn't the only extreme weather of 1936. In March of 1936, some of the worst flooding in U.S. history was occurring in the eastern United States. All eastern America under floodwaters. President signs appeal as capital flooded. 100 cities in 14 states affected. You'd see this whole region was flooded, and there was a huge dust storm raging out in the west at the same time. This is a picture of downtown Pittsburgh on March 21, 1936. They were under 10 feet of water. My grandfather was in a business meeting that day in downtown Pittsburgh and had to be evacuated by boat. A few weeks later came one of the worst tornado outbreaks in U.S. history, killing hundreds of people in the South. And a few weeks prior to that was the coldest February on record in the United States. Temperatures were more than 20 degrees below normal in Montana, and most of the country was way below normal. Niagara Falls froze solid that February. And then came the hottest summer on record in the United States. Temperatures in the Midwest in July averaged as much as 12 degrees above normal. So we've seen that 1934 was extremely hot and extremely dry. There was a worldwide drought. The poles were melting and sea level was going to rise 30 feet and drown all our cities. We also seen that 1936 was extreme. What about 1935? 1935 was also one of the most extreme years on record. There were massive dust storms in the United States during April of 1935. And then May of 1935 brought some incredible rainfalls. On Memorial Day weekend 1935, Woodward Ranch, Texas set the world's record rainfall of 22 inches of rain in less than 3 hours and 15 inches of rain in less than 2 hours. And a few hours prior to that record rainfall, Colorado also had some unbelievable rainfalls. 24 inches of rain in less than 6 hours. This is in a state which only averages 15 inches of rain per year. And that wasn't all the extreme weather of 1935. Labor Day weekend 1935 brought the most intense hurricane in U.S. history. The Labor Day hurricane of 1935 killed hundreds and hundreds of people. The winds were so strong it blew this train right off the tracks in the Florida Keys. So we've seen that the 1930s brought some unbelievably extreme weather, far beyond anything we've experienced in recent years. What about prior to that? Well, 1913 brought the hottest temperature ever recorded on Earth to California. On July 10, 1913, it was 134 degrees at Greenland Ranch, California. And that was in a week when temperatures were 128, 129, 134, 129, 130, 131, and 127. It's been a very long time since anywhere in the United States reached 130 degrees. I could go on all day with extreme weather events from the United States past. I have a huge library of them. But let's get right to the point. What are they trying to demonize in the National Climate Assessment? Well, it's carbon dioxide. At one time, they told us that 350 parts per million was the tipping point. If we went above that, we were doomed. So we passed 350 parts per million in 1988. Nothing bad happened. So they changed the target to 400 parts per million. If we went above that, we were doomed. Well, we passed that a couple years ago. And now they've moved it up to 450 parts per million. Yep, if we get above 450 parts per million, everything's going to fall apart, just like it did at 350 parts per million and 400 parts per million. I annotated this graph of U.S. all-time summer record daily maximum temperatures with CO2 levels. You see that in 1936 was the peak year for summer record maximum temperatures in the United States, and that a lot of them occurred prior to that. We also had one big year in 1988 when CO2 was 350 parts per million, and that was when James Hansen of NASA gave his testimony to Congress saying we were all doomed. And now that carbon dioxide is up to 400 parts per million, we hardly get any more record summer maximum temperatures. As CO2 has increased, the frequency of very hot days in the United States has decreased sharply. Most people want to believe that scientists are these honest people in white lab coats telling them the truth. But it's pretty clear that the people who wrote the National Climate Assessment have an agenda. That agenda is to demonize CO2. And I'll be continuing to expose this in the future. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.